Welcome to the Building Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Austin Tennell, and today we've got Matt Hayes on. I'm excited to have a conversation with him. We're going to cover a few things. We're going to talk about how he made it from a high-end architecture firm in New York City all the way down to Oklahoma City last year. And we'll get into the architecture profession and what you're doing now, and really wanting to talk to throughout my career, I've talked to a lot of younger people that are in architecture, or they're students, or they're in their mid-20s practicing architecture, and they're not feeling fully satisfied, and they're looking for what is that next thing? What is the other thing where I can be more hands-on, where I can have more control? And you've got a really interesting story about that, so want to just start a conversation about that. But to get going, why don't you just give a quick introduction about yourself, and then also go ahead and talk about how in the world you ended up from Manhattan to Oklahoma City.
Awesome. Yeah, stoked to be here. I think today's July 15th, which I think is actually exactly 1 year to the day.
Oh my God,
since
we didn't
my
even
first
plan
day
that.
here, which is
I had
which is
no
pretty
idea.
Cool. Yeah. So I grew up in Western New York. I kind of tripped into studying architecture at the University of Notre Dame, which is focused on traditional and classical architecture and urbanism. And I, as you said, worked in New York City for GP Schafer Architect, now Schafer Buccellato and Partners, which is a high-end residential firm focused on traditional and classical residential projects. And we had crossed paths while I was at Notre Dame and you were apprenticing, doing your Masonry apprenticeship, and reconnected a couple of years ago. And one thing led to another, and the opportunity to come down and join Building Culture on really confronting the problems of bad car-centric urbanism and disposable building in America today was too exciting to pass up.
Yeah, well, it's super exciting to have you here. It's really changed just how building culture functions on a day-to-day basis and what's possible as we're really starting to lay the groundwork for scaling. But before getting into any of that, Matt, you mentioned meeting back when I was apprenticing. So that's kind of an interesting story. I'd forgotten about that little piece, but this is 2015 or maybe 2016. It was probably summer 2016, I would think.
Yeah.
I'm out there in the middle of Carlton Landing, Oklahoma. Just moved there probably 6 months before with my wife, and working hard, laying brick, working for Clay Chapman, who is my teacher. It's kind of get me so much of what I know about building. And then tell me about how you ended up down there in 2016.
Yeah, sort of luck or just a happy coincidence. My freshman year at Notre Dame, a group brought Clay in to do a demonstration and speak about what he was working on using structural brick masonry to kind of subvert disposable building practice in America. And really piqued my interest, resonated with me a lot. So my sophomore year, wrote a grant to go down and work with them for a week over spring break. Loved that. Other people were interested. So after I got back from studying in Rome my third year, we organized a trip for 10 students to come down and build a small cottage with Clay and his apprentices over the course of 2 weeks. And we completed the masonry massing in 2 weeks, I think, with a couple of long weekend days from the apprentices mixed in there.
Those were very long days, because we built an entire house in 14 days, right?
Yeah. I mean, what was really cool about that too was, there were 3 apprentices there who were learning, and a couple of people there, Thomas Doherty, who's a friend and
oh my
collaborator of
gosh,
ours
I forgot that's where I met him.
Yeah, he had some timber framing background. I had a little construction experience, but the bulk of us really had no one had experience with brick masonry. So you had 10 totally green people there, mixing mortar, climbing up scaffolding, laying brick. And so for that to be, this construction method to be that accessible, to pull that off in 2 weeks was pretty awesome.
No, that's it really was impressive. And there's a few things that you mentioned that I want to touch on. So for one, you're off in Indiana at Notre Dame, and why come to Clay Chapman for a week, right? Why come down to the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma? There's builders in Indiana too, in South Bend, that are much closer.
Yeah.
What drew you guys? Because not just you, but other people that came with you.
Yeah. So the really unique thing about what he was and is still doing in Carlton Landing, Oklahoma, is that he's working with structural brick masonry, which, is how we build many of our buildings here at Building Culture as well. And the fact that he was using that rather than stick framing, which is how almost every brick building we see in America today, we know is, a wood framed or a metal framed or a concrete framed structure with usually a single layer brick veneer around it. Very different from a solid brick wall, as things were done historically. And to the best of our knowledge, Clay was the only one doing that in the U.S. at that time. And now he's not. Now we have a couple more satellites, from people who have learned from him, your fellow apprentices and yourself.
And just to touch on this, for a lot of people that don't know, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole today, but when you're talking about structural masonry and versus stick framing, what we mean is rather than these 2x4s or 2x6s with a single layer of brick on the outside that basically is just a veneer, it's a replacement for hardy siding or wood siding. It's a durable siding, but it's a siding that's held up by the wood structure. Versus when we say structural masonry, we mean that the walls and the structure are masonry. So it means basically they're thick enough that they become self-supporting, self-stabilizing. So really that's at least 8 inches thick. You see garden walls at 8 inches thick, but houses stuff, they'll be 12 inches thick, 16 inches thick of solid masonry. And all the old buildings, and probably any of you listening in your downtowns, the cool coffee shops, the cool restaurants, the converted loft, they're probably an old structural masonry building. If there's exposed brick on the interior, that's probably what it is.
Right.
And really the inspiration behind that is building to last centuries. But I don't want to go down that route today, but I am interested in kind of like, so you saw what he was doing, but clay and structural masonry and stuff there's a reason that Notre Dame, it appealed to kind of Notre Dame in general. And, Notre Dame is a very unique architecture school, probably one of the most unique architecture schools in the country and one of the best architecture schools in the country, in my opinion. Tell me about what it is about Notre Dame School of Architecture that made the school itself interested in supporting you coming down to learn about structural masonry.
Definitely. Notre Dame, the School of Architecture focuses on traditional and classical design principles, within the context of traditional urbanism. And traditional urbanism is really historical urbanism, looking back at great cities of the past, pre-automobile cities that were designed for people first, to be walkable, and for people to be able to live their lives within the sphere of where they could walk. So, mixing residential areas with commercial areas, civic areas, institutional areas. So Notre Dame is a very unique program, as you mentioned. Everyone, parts of it are based on the École des Beaux-Arts which is the historic kind of French, the Atelier in Paris, where many French architects trained and American architects and architects from other countries traveled to train. So we start out freshman year by learning hand drafting and watercolor rendering and hand sketching. In sophomore year, you learn the orders of classical architecture. And I think a lot of times people hear classical architecture and they think columns, and sort of some people think outdated, passé, not their style. But classical architecture, when you're really delving into it, as it's taught at Notre Dame, is really a system, an ordering system and a hierarchical system. And so starting with the orders and then learning how to deploy them in different building compositions is a great way for young architects to learn how to create hierarchy between different elements and spaces of their buildings, and how to compose things with pleasing proportions. And classicism is a language that, thousands of years old, and countless societies have, innovated in it and refined it in different places. So it's easy to study precedents, and it because it's been around so long and is prominent in so many civic and important buildings, it has a meaning to people, and it's a living language that's kind of been iterated on and refined to, and iterated on, and it's a living language that's been iterated on and refined, and we continue that tradition today. So Notre Dame kind of has the urbanism angle, the classicism angle, and then also the local vernacular, studying the architecture of a place, because most buildings throughout history weren't built by architects. The vernacular is what the people of a place crafted to meet their needs. And I think we as designers and builders today can really learn a lot from all three of those principles: traditional urbanism, classicism, and the local vernacular of where we're building.
Man, yeah, really well said. And that's one of the things that I found so interesting about Notre Dame is they really do emphasize that you can't take architecture as in buildings out of their context, and the context being the city, the town, the neighborhood. You can build some nice houses off in the woods somewhere, and that's fine. That is still architecture, but as an industry, as just an actual profession, you're always dealing within the environment, within the context. And you've heard me talk about, I think about urbanism as the recipe and buildings as the ingredients, and you need both for a good meal. If you have a great recipe and crappy ingredients, it's a mediocre meal. And actually, I would argue that if you have to choose one or the other, you would rather get a really great, recipe with mediocre ingredients than great ingredients with a mediocre recipe. And what I mean by that is it's caring about not just the individual buildings themselves, but how those buildings interact with each other, how those buildings create space. And so one of the things that struck me about Notre Dame is they're like this very high-minded about things, but it's high-minded about ideals. It's about humans, and it's about the human experience. So it's not like this arrogance of architecture as starchitects or something, right? It's about how do we actually serve people and the city and create beautiful, flourishing places. And it's just amazing to see a school teaching students this.
And that probably shouldn't be amazing, but it's such a stark contrast to what's happening really in almost every architecture school across America today, where you see a lot of students who don't design real buildings till later semesters, if ever. It's very focused on formal and artistic expression, a lot of times invention rather than study of precedent and learning from the past. I personally am not confident enough, to say that I can come up with something better than anyone has ever done before. I think looking to and learning from the past is critical in architecture. There's nothing new under the sun. Good artists borrow, great artists steal. And so it's shocking that the vast majority of architecture programs in the U.S. and really worldwide have completely overlooked and really are vilifying, traditional architecture and learning from the past, which doesn't mean we have to build in a traditional style. I mean, many vernaculars look quite modern, and I think a lot of modernist architecture is really brilliant, but the great modernists of the 20th century all were classically trained. So, and I think we're drifting away from that. There are a handful of schools in the U.S. that are doing a really good job of stewarding that. But
it's like Le Corbusier, who was studied as a traditional architect, or like Picasso actually started off as a traditional painter, studying under the greats, and then went off and explored some. And not, I don't have a strong opinion. I'm not an art study, but about say Picasso. But
same with Mies van der Rohe. And Corbusier is interesting because he had that study, but then he completely jettisoned the traditional urbanism idea. And if we look at his idealized city plans, they were really predecessors to our segregated suburban city structure today, where you have separate housing and separate commercial space and kind of dire office parks. Really, really unpleasant.
Yeah, it really is.
I danced around your original question. I got so fired up about Notre Dame, and I sort of lost track of why clay and why that structural masonry angle resonated with what we do at Notre Dame. And we talked a little bit about looking to the past, and I think when we look back at these great traditional cities and traditional buildings, we learn that societies over the buildings that are still around today, that have been around for hundreds or thousands of years, are built of structural masonry. And that's because societies from the ancients, to cities like London and Chicago rebuilding after fires, they initially built however they could with wood construction or other means, but over time, as they had the means, they built with masonry because it's the most durable, and it allows them to really create something that lasts beyond themselves, where you can pass something down to your children, give something good to your city, have a sense of civic pride with the institutional buildings that they're creating. And that, historically, for 2,000 years plus, has been how humans have looked at building. And that outlook shifted recently in the U.S., which is, like you said, we won't go too far down that rabbit hole today, but it's interesting to consider. And so that someone building with structural masonry was so unique, yet also resonated so much with everything we were learning in sophomore design studio, that it got people pretty excited.
Yeah, you're like studying all this ancient architecture that still inspires people today, and then you looked and you're like, holy cow, someone's actually like doing that in real life in the United States and in Oklahoma of all places.
Yeah.
But very serendipitous moment that you came down and really glad you did, and glad I went up to New York a couple of years ago and chatted with you for a year, and that you ended up moving down here.
Yeah, that was. You were up there, I think, accepting an award from the ICAA, and we kind of kept in touch over 7 years or so. But
Yeah,
it had been a while, and so that 15 or 20-minute conversation lit a fire.
Yeah,
and here we are.
Yeah, boy. Continuing just a few thoughts on the architecture school stuff, and I remember one of the other apprentices with me. He went to I won't say the university. I don't know if it's appropriate or not to. So I went to a decently well-known university, not some like. But people would know the name, and he went to their architecture program. I think he dropped out after, I don't know, 2 or 3 years. I could be wrong there. But I remember him talking about one of the main projects that they were doing was designing buildings based on human organs. And he like showed me some of the work of his and students, and it's like nonsensical. Like it doesn't even make sense. They're not really designing anything. It's like the architecture departments in schools are in the arts department, and the construction management is in the business department, and the engineering is in the science department. So kind of going along that hyper specialization and segregation within the industry we've talked about within architecture that's in the arts program, which really architecture is such a practical field too, right? You're building things, you're designing things that people are going to be living in, but then they're teaching people as if it's just this kind of abstract piece of art that's all about you and your expression and, being different and surprising people and I've even picked up, and I've argued with people about this. Some people disagree with me, but that a lot of, as you're saying, a lot of modernist architecture, there's great modernist architecture out there. There's a whole lot of bad modernist architecture out there. There's a whole lot of bad traditional architecture out there. I would say, quote, traditional, almost fake traditional architecture. But a lot of modern architecture teaching in schools seem to be almost anti-beauty and anti-human. And I think that's an odd, strange place to be. How are you going to build places that people love if you despise beauty and despise people? And that might sound like I'm exaggerating a bit, but
I don't think really, though, I think the architectural educational establishment today, there's brilliant people who come out of all kinds of architectural programs, but a lot of times in spite of it, or because of their other experiences play into their success a lot more. I think what you said earlier is true. I in my free time sometimes teach with the Institute for Classical Art and Architecture, and we do workshops around the country, including actually at the school you're referencing. And it's always surprising, like I alluded to earlier, to go into these studios and see these art projects, for lack of a better, and that's a generalization. There are some that are more than that, but many that are more than that. But especially in early years, it starts out being so abstract and expressive, and really focusing on serving the students, or more often the professor's aesthetic preference and own quote unquote creative genius. And that's a disservice to the people who the building would be built for, and to the student themselves, because you're exiting architecture school with some great rendering abilities, but not really knowing how to put a building together, how to talk about putting a building together, how to talk about the construction process. And a lot of people wind up, shoehorned being into the ADA bathroom specialist and drawing code diagrams in Revit, which, is not why I don't think anyone really gets into architecture or architecture school in the first place.
Some of the architects that I actually like, architects that I respect most, aren't too big on architecture, the profession, or the the academic side. I mean, whether it's Steve Mazan or Andres Dewani. Actually, this apprentice, when we were walking with Andres Dewani, it's a long time ago in Carlton Landing when he was down, and this guy was, this apprentice was saying, I was in architecture school, and he said, "I'm sorry, are you okay?" In classic Andreas fashion. But he has a point. I really do think he has a point.
Definitely. I mean, one commonality across architecture schools pretty much across the board is it's hard. I mean, it's a lot of hours. It's usually a 5-year program. There's an accreditation process for schools that plays into licensure. So it's a shame to not get what you want out of it. And I think that's something, for anyone listening who's thinking about going to architecture school, it's just something to consider about where you pick. There's more and more good programs in the U.S. that are really teaching people how to design great buildings and how to, work within a traditional framework, even if you learn within a traditional framework, even if you don't end up working within it, whether it's Notre Dame, Benedictine College, Catholic University, Utah Valley University, University of Miami. There's more and more good options out there. And I think depending on what you want to do, it can be really important to make sure you pick the right place, because architects in general and architecture professors, sometimes do have strong opinions about most things, and so you can find yourself shoehorned into working on things that maybe weren't what you expected. If you end up depending on where you end up.
That's one of the things that I wanted to come back to, was how a lot of architecture schools are teaching, and they're actually what would you call it, opposed to this idea of traditional or classic architecture. And I think of traditional architecture and classical architecture not as, we'd call it the 5 orders, but that's not what classical architecture is. That is, the orders, it's not. And I think of classical architecture not as a style, but as a value system, really. And that's always evolving and innovating. I mean, there was all sorts of classical architecture that was new at the time. And really what tradition means to me, tradition is innovation that actually worked over time, right? Because everything is new when you're trying something. And so tradition or classical something, when I use the word traditional, I mean it's been tested for long periods of time, and it's got a durable physical attributes, it's got durable aesthetic attributes, and really, we talk about, for buildings to last, they have to be not only durable physically and adaptable, but they have to be beautiful. They have to be lovable, because people take care of things that are loved, and so the kind of objection to traditional architecture, I don't think holds a lot of water, and when they do, I think they're confusing style for what I think it really means is a way of thinking and a value system and principles.
I couldn't agree more, and you touched on all of those elements that give a building staying power, and Steve Buzan's book, The Original Green, was one of those books that I was assigned my, I think, freshman or sophomore year of architecture school that really impacted me, and the lessons I took away from that are, I would say, a big reason why I'm here and why I went to work with Clay for a couple weeks in the first place. So definitely recommend that as a read to anyone listening. I couldn't agree more with what you're saying in terms of traditional architecture. It's not a style. It can be a vernacular tradition within different places. And I do think there's something to a language within a local vernacular or within classical architecture. But as you allude to, the classical architecture is not just the 5 orders. Usually when we teach it, we do start with the 5 orders, and that there's a reason for that. It's the most accessible way to understand the ordering systems, how there's a proportional relationship from the smallest part to the biggest whole. But as you allude to, when we deploy the classical language today, maybe 2% of buildings that are exhibiting classical principles actually have columns on them. And another important part about classicism and traditional architecture and what we see in these great cities we look to as precedents is hierarchy. So there's an ordering system, and there's also hierarchy between buildings. Rarely, if ever, is it appropriate in a complete neighborhood that has all kinds of functions to throw columns on every building. How do you know the church is the church if Joe Schmo's house has 25-foot Corinthian columns on front of it?
I love that point.
And we can drive around Oklahoma City and see houses with 25-foot Corinthian columns on.
And that's such a good point, because we talk about this, but the greatest towns and cities in the world, they're made up of fabric buildings. 90% fabric buildings or more, and then 10% punctuation, or even just 3% punctuation. And I mean punctuation being the civic buildings, the churches, the cathedrals, the town halls, the city centers, the event spaces. But everything else is kind of like a backdrop where every house is not trying to pop out at you. Now, if you look at it and you examine it, it's beautiful in its own way. But, and actually another Steve Mouzon thing is he talks about diversity within a narrow range. That's what makes a good neighborhood. You do need diversity. You don't want everything to look the same, but you also need it to work together, because if everything is just, this thing and that thing, it doesn't really work. And something that I love that John Anderson said, it's always stuck with me, is he talks about how people complain about cookie cutter houses. Driving, that's a very, like, you hear that all the time. I think I even used to use that phrase. You drive in a suburban neighborhood and all the houses just look the same. And you're like, there's also cookie cutter. But that's not what makes them actually bad. They're bad cookies. Like Arjan makes the point, like, people love cookies. They're just bad cookies. And I think he's absolutely right. It's not that all the houses in suburbia look the same. In fact, they actually try way too hard to make them look different in a lot of ways. That's how you get 10 gables and 15, 4 dormers and 20 hips on a roof, and you're going, what in the world is going on? Because people are trying to, and a bunch of corners and all sorts of details, but it's not actually creating anything beautiful, and it's not paying attention to the buildings next to it. It's trying to be its own individual thing, and it's not, because it's a mosaic. That's how I think about cities, and I know, I think at Notre Dame too, where our cities and our towns and neighborhoods are really a mosaic of all these individual pieces that collectively paint something, extraordinary and beautiful, so much more than just a little piece. And you can have multiple storylines within a mosaic, multiple complete places within a whole. And I think that's a really cool way to think about cities.
And a lot of pieces of that mosaic are just background, or the fabric buildings you alluded to. If every piece was, a shiny star, it would be incoherent, and the important parts wouldn't be elevated and wouldn't have that hierarchy. And I think that's important. I can't remember where it was something podcast or writing, but that was another influential thing when I was, really chewing on coming down to join building culture. I remember you were talking at one point about the nobility of fabric buildings and your interest in doing great fabric buildings. And I think that's another problem, with where we're at in a building, as a building industry today. I think building great, important buildings is fun. Like, I think we both, would love to do a monastery and a town hall, and hopefully we do, but 95% of what's built is fabric buildings. And so I think not allowing ourselves to step away from our egos as designers and say that, this house I'm doing has to be a capital A architectural statement, and is going to be the best house on the street, and how can this house be part of a great street, is really an important switch to flip, for 80% plus of the work that we do. And
you mentioned the word, I don't know if you actually said the word humility or something, but you said something very close, and that reminds me of, even what you guys do at Notre Dame, or just the idea of looking back at precedent, which, it's like you talk to any Notre Dame student and like within a few sentences, they'll say the word precedent. And you don't hear that from other architecture students talking about precedent. And I think it takes a little humility to actually be saying, like, let's look back at the past and see what works. Mm-hmm. It's not that we want to copy what they did, right? Because it's 2023. It's different times. We have cars. There's other, we have air conditioners, right? It's not about copying, but it's about looking what works and then reframing that and evolving that into what that means in the 21st century.
100%. I mean, you have to have some ego on you to think that you can inventively do things better than anyone else who has built anything before in history. And I mean, we use the word starchitect, and there are some people who arguably have done that or have made tremendous innovations, and I think if you look at Frank Gehry or Zaha Hadid, those are very inventive forms and not looking at precedent, but those are also typically object buildings that are really more sculptural and artistic expressions. And as an architecture student and a professional looking forward to a life of work, I can probably count the number of starchitects with successful firms and careers of their own on one hand, and then there's a heck of a lot of people doing their Rhino models. But if you are willing to go build good traditional neighborhoods and build some fabric buildings and some buildings that are higher in the order of importance. There's an opportunity for such a varied career and body of work.
So speaking of looking at precedent, at Notre Dame, the undergrad, they spend a year in Rome? Is that right?
Yeah, I think undergrad's a year in Rome, and then the graduate school, everyone spends a semester in Rome. And truth be told, that was like sort of a serendipitous beginning to me being here today, probably, because when I was looking at colleges, I was kind of torn between architecture and journalism, and really the only thing that stuck out to me about Notre Dame architecture was that you got to go to Rome for a year. I was like nervous about being pigeonholed in the irrelevant. So truth be told, like that, truth be told, the Rome Studies program was one of the main reasons I went to Notre Dame and wound up on the path that brought me here today. Going into college, I was looking at different architecture programs, and the Rome Studies program was incredibly attractive. I was really worried about being pigeonholed by irrelevant classicism and traditional architecture. I was concerned about that when looking at Notre Dame, and I drank the Kool-Aid fairly quick there. But I really can't say enough about how formative that was for all of us. We spent sophomore year, studying classicism and studying traditional precedents. How floor plans in Roman palazzi work, and then to get to go there and study that and live, for most or all of us, it was our first time living in a walkable city. And talk about a great walkable city to start out with, the center of Rome. We were living on Campo dei Fiori, walking or taking the bus half an hour to school by the Forum, walking by the Colosseum every day. And so you're just surrounded not only with this rich architectural precedent around every corner, but also urbanism and organic urbanism that's evolved over millennia, at the hands of the people living there.
You mentioned organic urbanism. What do you mean by that?
Organic, when I think of organic urbanism, I really think of a place that is created by the processes and people occupying it. And we could certainly have organic urban plans that are pre-designed, and a lot of what we do today with some urbanism is very intentional. But looking at organic forms rather than something completely rectilinear on a grid, whether that's the Jeffersonian grid or Newtown in a place like whether that's the Jeffersonian grid or a place like Newtown in Edinburgh, a lot of times humans and especially planners and bureaucrats, instinct is to organize and to put things on a grid. And there's some great gridded cities, but there's also a ton of richness when we let an urban space be more organic and have streets with terminated vistas and long curving streets that create dynamic views, pull you down a street and into the next space. And Rome really was that. There's definitely been boulevards plowed through it at different times that are, some of them create really interesting spaces too. But my favorite spaces there and in many cities are the kind of secondary and tertiary streets and alleys that, you can see the hands of the people who've lived there on the buildings and also on the urban forms. Most or all of which would be illegal to build in most cities in America today.
Yeah, no, that I like you said some of that. And the other thing I think about in terms of organic architecture is this idea of, all the, and you can do this once again with more rectilinear orderly plans, but where all the buildings really are shaping and framing space, but particularly in these more kind of like organic patterns, it feels like the public spaces and the streets and the walkable spaces and the piazzas are carved from the buildings themselves, and then the buildings are left over. And if you think about just even from like an evolutionary standpoint of walking through like a canyon, right? Or like a forest, trees, they're only certain height. And that was one of the things that struck me about Rome when I was there is, and other European cities too, is we think of them as being ultra dense, but they're only like 4 to 5 stories tall, most of them. Versus, Manhattan or something is, just skyscrapers. And the difference to me of the humanness of the scale of 4 to 5 stories, I'm not saying you can't go higher ever, right? But That really struck me as a very human element of just the scale and the feeling and the comfort that comes from that.
Definitely. And it's an easy density. It feels, like you said, very human. You know, if someone has a flower box outside their windows, if it's 4 or 5 stories up, you know, that's still contributing to the space on the street rather than kind of a, you know, manufactured high rise where you're not part of life on the street. You're going back, even though you're just going up an elevator, you're kind of stepping back beyond your suburban hedge and really not participating in urban life as much as something that's on a more human scale.
You mentioned, you know, someone hanging out flowers out their window on a 4th story, and it made me think of one of the other things you were talking about. What, you know, that sometimes it's our predilection to try to overly organize things, which seems like a very human thing to do. Mm-hmm. And we have certainly done that with architecture. You know, we talked about, hey, we took all the ingredients that make a city, you know, whether it's where you work and offices and where you shop and retail, and then the schools and the medical centers and the housing, which used to be much more combined. I don't mean it's just thrown together. There were still residential neighborhoods and stuff, but in a much more coherent and cohesive pattern. And I really think so much of our thinking about how we build cities today in the United States in particular came about from, you know, the Industrial Revolution and manufacturing in particular. We started, you know, how do you break down a complex process? You break it down into simple processes that one person can handle. You know, so one person is wrapping the things, and that's all they do all day long up a conveyor belt. And that's how you break down a complicated process. And that's what we've tried to do with both, well, lots of things. Agriculture is a great example of monoculture agriculture, that we are depleting our soils and just pumping them full of increasing more of pesticides and fertilizers because, you know, the soil is depleting, the nutrients aren't there, and we're relying more on it. Well, we did the same thing with city building here. We tried to like make it so orderly, and we've got our, you know, fire departments, and we've got our engineers, and we've got all these different pieces. But then it doesn't feel real anymore. It's like loses its sense of what it actually is and could be. Like good cities have a little chaos.
I completely agree. And I think those are the most beautiful parts of it. And, you know, we as designers, you know, should strive to create beautiful things for sure, but we can't make a place vibrant on its own. You know, we're really creating a canvas for the people who live there. And, you know, if we can give them a good canvas that'll last a couple 100 years rather than a flimsy, you know, piece of toilet paper, that's, you know, us doing our job, but, you know, really creating a forum for people to live in and have a flourishing public life. And I think there's an interesting connection to what you're saying, you know, in terms of the size of our cities and becoming more specialized, and also what that means for the building industry that's doing it. You know, when you're operating at a mid-sized scale and building 1 to 5 story buildings, those are projects that, you know, smaller entities, smaller people, smaller companies can take on, where you might have, you could have a company like ours, a design build company, tackle a building like that, versus if you go to, you know, a Burj Khalifa scale high rise, no one company can tackle that. You need such a different array of expertise, you know, from engineers, architects, general contractor. And so you need that specialization for a project like that. But because of that, there's a lot of fragmentation and inefficiency too. So when we're building at that larger fragmented urban scale, we also kind of see the same, what we now know are problems or difficulties pop up within the building industry as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So how do you think, you know, you mentioned Rome really influencing you and shaping you. How do you think spending a year there for students, what are like some of the biggest like valuable takeaways that not just, you know, so you can be personal about it, but also just in general speaking that you even heard other people say, like leaving changed and how they think about things?
I think for everyone it was different, but some of the commonalities were just the richness of the architecture there. I mean, it's a pretty unique place, and that there's ancient Roman architecture there, and it was also, you know, one of the core cities of the Italian Renaissance, and, you know, right up until today there's interesting work happening there. So the richness of things you can study within a 15-minute walk and a 20-minute walk, and also get to experience as a resident, being there for a whole year rather than kind of a quick study abroad stop. Like you really become a citizen of the city. You have your rhythms of life, and you get to experience how those great architectural and urban moments and design choices impact your daily life. What's it like to walk through the Piazza Navona? What's it like to go to your favorite pizza place and get a slice and then have a fountain to go sit on, or go to a wine bar where you can sit out on a narrow street that has cars moving down it, but there's no curbs, no separated curb and sidewalk, and there's people walking down the street. So cars are, intruding into the pedestrian space and have to do it respectfully rather than people having to cower away from the cars. Those, I think the rhythms of life in a great city like that were one of the biggest takeaways for me. And I think in particular in a city that was designed not all of it was intentionally designed, but a city that got most of its armature and form hundreds, if not thousands of years before the advent of the automobile. So something that truly was designed for people, which is a stark contrast to a lot of places in America, Oklahoma City in particular. This is Oklahoma City is an interesting study because it's such a young city, a little over 100 years old, and for almost all of its life has been dictated by automobile arterials, and we can see the difference that in the form that the city's taken. And I think just now people are beginning to realize that doesn't have a positive effect on their everyday life when we design a city for the automobile first and people second. So, and frankly, that's not a comparison that would have been readily apparent to me, without having seen the alternative.
I agree. Traveling shaped me in so many ways, particularly around this area, because I agree. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs of Houston, one of the sprawling, great big cities of America. And I couldn't even imagine not having a car. Like, I didn't even have the eyes to see what was wrong, really, per se, or certainly not the words. But after experiencing, and I spent a good bit of time in Spain and Italy, getting to, like you're saying, that day to day and going like, oh my gosh, this is what life could be like. And don't get me wrong, there are still cars and people still own cars. And it's not about being anti-car, it's about being pro-human. And that's a very big difference. And that's where I wish we could get to here in Oklahoma City, is this idea of what kind of lifestyle, what kind of life, what kind of city do we want to build? How do we want people to interact? What do we want to see as we go about our daily lives? And then back into how to get there. Mm-hmm. But instead, it's just like every year, it's just like, expand the highway. Build. And then we try to create all these community spaces. And it's like, you would think people are starting from scratch and they could just go, like you're saying, to Piazza Navona and look at what makes a successful square or piazza. But we don't really do that. It seems like we just kind of try something and hope and, throw a concrete bench somewhere and assume people are going to sit there. And then when we don't, we're surprised.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times too, we look at it in our individual cities here, we look at it as a design problem, and really it's an economic and a development problem as well. Because in order to create the kind of businesses that and amenities that make it nice to live in a walkable place like that, we need density, and it can be a gentle density, like you were talking about. It doesn't have to be high-rise buildings; it could be mid-rise buildings. I was in New Orleans a few months ago, and that's very dense, and it's mostly with 1- and 2-story buildings,
right?
That are either attached or only separated by a couple feet. And we see here in a lot of our suburban neighborhoods, those houses are separate. Everyone has their own lawn, but how much utility do we really get out of a tiny strip of grass in between you and your neighbor's identical house?
And how much water and glyphosate gets sprayed on it just to maintain it?
Exactly. A lot of times you have more functional private space in the backyard of your attached townhouse.
Mm-hmm. So, kind of want to wrap up, coming a little bit more personal here to Oklahoma City in this past year. So you went to Notre Dame, you spent 5 years there, then you went to work for GP Schafer in New York City for 4 years, which is an excellent firm doing really incredible and impressive work. And then, and it sounded like you really enjoyed it too. But then you moved here, and like, what does your job look like on a day? And just so everyone knows, so Matt is a licensed architect, was a licensed architect in New York, and now has gotten reciprocity here in Oklahoma City. And he's also a project manager for Building Culture. So he's like an architect and a project manager. So can you talk to me about like, what is your day-to-day look like, and how is that different from what you were doing before, and how is that different from what most architects are doing?
Definitely. So a big part of what drew me to joining the building culture team was working within a true holistic design build workflow, and working for a small business that's doing something really hard, and kind of rowing against the current of convention and of what the industry is today, and that carries through in what we do on a day-to-day basis. In a lot of projects in the building industry, there's a separate designer or architect and then a general contractor. And those are completely separate entities. The owner or the client for a project has different contracts with both of them. And so things sort of function in a triangle shape between the architect, the builder, and the owner, and potentially other parties. We're trying to make that a lot more holistic in hopes that we can leverage that, for a better and more efficient end result. So our day-to-day is rarely the same. And I'm really enjoying that. I spend a lot of time designing. I also spend a lot of time doing lumber takeoffs and checking that framers have everything square and plumb and the window openings are in the right location. And I think that that makes me better at both of those, knowing potential construction pitfalls and how things go together in the field, and how to communicate with people who are putting things together about problems or about better ways of doing things that they might know of that I don't, makes me a better designer, and vice versa. It's really effective, for both of us. That's been one of my favorite parts of the job in the year that I've been here is, when we're out on site or one of us is out on site and, we're able to make design decisions and really do substantial design work in the moment in the field. And that gives us some flexibility and efficiency sometimes. And it also, allows us to respond to conditions that might not be apparent sitting at the computer, and sometimes for a better result. So really been enjoying that. And then, we're, like we discussed earlier, working toward making complete places in addition to excellent buildings. So, everything from the tiny, working on the tiniest detail of finished houses to, urban design and development work and charrettes is part of what we do on a daily basis. And I think that variety makes it fun, and also helps all the projects we're working on, that each product has one or two people who are involved in it, soup to nuts. There's no handoff, there's no loss of information or confusion. Like, it really streamlines things and, allows us to deliver excellent work, very efficiently.
Yeah, we really do we're in a unique position to offer like a product that is very difficult to replicate without the process that we use. And that's one of the things that I've enjoyed the most in having you down this past year, is riffing off each other out in the field, finishing out a house. I kind of had this philosophy of, yes, you need to design things and think ahead, but you also want to be good enough to be able to leave things for later that you don't have to make a decision on now. Because if you're having to make every decision 2 years before the project's completed, like, that's a lot of decisions to make.
And frankly, neither of us have time to make all those decisions that far in advance, because a more pressing ball would get dropped, on a project that's being built now.
And then it locks you in. And for me, it's like, I often have an idea when I'm designing of a house. I'll start getting but it's something that unfolds over time. I think about it like writing a book. You talk to writers and they talk about how, they'll imagine this character and they'll start writing about the character. And then over time, the character starts writing their own story. Like, what would the character say? Yeah. And I feel like that's the way with our houses when we're designing and building them holistically in this way. It's, what does this house need? We're standing in there and going, what do we want to do under the stairs? Do we want to do this bench? Do we want to do an office? And then what kind of feel do we want? And then we get inspired by a single light fixture, and then that shapes these other decisions. And it's all happening in real time, and it's a little chaotic, right? And we're getting better at making it orderly, like chaos within a structure.
Yeah, and there's been some hard-won lessons there about what we can kick
Too much chaos.
what we can kick the decisions down the road on, and what we can't. I've learned so much there already in my short time here, and I think that just makes us even more effective. We're learning from each pitfall and planning ahead, and I think some of the most compelling parts of the house, all the houses we're working on right now, are those parts that weren't on drawings, but are being born out of
right.
inspiration.
Yeah, like we don't do any trim details in our design drawings. Essentially, like we have some like ideas, but I mean, we'll have the floor plans and elevations, and we might, we'll have kitchen cabinets drawn in terms of where they're going. But like a lot of that happens, like we were drawing up crown molding in the field 2 weeks before we needed it, and then getting a custom blade and cutting it, and then ordering it, and it turned out fantastic.
And I think that's some of the most rewarding work is when we're collaborating with the tradespeople who are doing that type of stuff. We're working on some custom metal stairs and metal cabinets for a project now, and we did, I drew some Sharpie drawings on a subfloor, and the people who are going to be bringing this to life are in some cases doing drawings, and in other cases we're going to their shops and dry stacking material, and taking pictures and sending it to the clients and looking at different finishes. So it's an incredibly rigorous design process still, but it's happening in a different manner, and really allowing us to leverage the expertise of the trim carpenters, the tile setters, the fabricators, the drywall finishers. Everyone who has a part of the process is bringing their expertise and their knowledge to it, which I think makes the project much richer than anything that either one of us or us together could do alone.
I agree. It really is a collaborative process.
And I think it's worth noting, we hear design build thrown around a lot. A lot of, I probably need two hands to count the amount of, vehicles I see driving around with design build on the side every day. But what we do is a little different in terms of the same people designing. It's not only the same company designing and building, it's the same people. We both have tools in our trucks. We, the tools aren't clean. We're a small company, we use them on a daily basis. And I think that being that in touch with what's happening in the field, whether or not it's one of us swinging a hammer, one of us is there, is really unique. Like I don't know many other places that have kind of that holistic an approach, which there's pros and cons to, but I think as an employee, like it's really fun, and it allows us to do really, really good work.
Yeah, I mean, we are doing, like, you and me are designing houses, managing the construction, and doing the interiors. Mm-hmm. So it really is like a completely holistic, vision. It's every house is quite literally a piece of art, like carefully crafted together. And one of the things that I've enjoyed so much of having you down is, you've got, I would call it like a $20 million eye. So, I come from a different background. I was trained differently in things, and I've learned a lot and I've grown a lot, but you immediately came in, from your experience, both at Notre Dame, which is a very high level of rigor and detail oriented, but also GP Schafer when you're working on $20 million homes. And that's a different level of detail. And so when I saw your first cabinet markup, and I thought I cared about the cabinets and I'm like, hey, we want the trash over here and that's too big and blah, blah. I mean, the amount of red on that cabinet drawing was hilarious. Maybe. And it was like, the style is 2.5 inches. That needs to be 2 inches, and I mean, just so many things, but it's like, it's upped our, if you walk through one of our houses now, and start looking at all these kind of little details that a lot of times go by people, just how things terminate into each other and around stairs. I mean, we've really upped our game, and I love it. It's awesome.
Maybe that's why that first cabinet company flaked on us. But
we did. Well, we have a little bit too much detail, I think, for some people.
We found some excellent partners who we're really enjoying working with, and the interior design angle was something that I didn't know how much time we were going to spend on before I came down here, and I've been really enjoying. I think it's hard. It's not either of our first strength. It's hard. It's a heavy lift. It takes a lot of hours. But rolling that design intention in with everything else in the construction process, and being able to hold some of those decisions back and make them later, in terms of light locations and color, and how, tile and color are coming together is really, really fun. And, it's an important part of the end result. I think Gil Schafer would say that bad architecture, I don't know if he said that, I'm going to cut that. But I know someone once said that good interior design can mask bad architecture, and bad architecture and good architecture can't make up for bad interior design. And so I think that rolling that piece in has been really, really fun and something I've enjoyed.
It's a great way to put it. I mean, it's like, I don't know if this is a good comparison, but you can take like a person, that's the architecture, right? And then the clothes and the hair and the makeup and how they present themselves, that's the interior design. And you can have a beautiful person and you can make them not beautiful.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Do their hair and all that.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that really surprised me too when you came down was, and we talked about this, right? Because part of your motivation is you wanted to be more hands-on. You wanted to be more in this holistic process. You wanted to be involved with construction. You were like, I want to be out on the job site laying brick and learning how to do that and all that. But what I was surprised by it was how competent you were, like on day one on job sites. Like I wasn't expecting. I knew you'd had like a little bit of experience here and there. And, we met on Clay's job site, where you're working for 2 weeks. But that's very different from really understanding the construction process. And I know you've learned a ton over the past year. But, I mean, you came in knowing, very helpful on a job site, being able to kind of jump in on that and help manage jobs. Where in the world did you, really get all that experience? Because that is not typical for most architects that I've met.
That's something that I really tripped into, and I think I was lucky to trip into it. But it's really, anyone who's in architecture school or considering it now, it's a great. It's really important to know, and a great way to get started. I mean, looking even at yourself, who you started in the industry as a masonry apprentice, and taught yourself design, and were able to teach yourself design by understanding the way that things were built. And I was lucky in a high school drafting class. A couple guys from a design build company in Rochester came in to talk, and were, really emphasizing the importance of experience in the field. And so I called them on it. My first summer home from college, I called them up and asked them if I could work with them. And I, for my first 3 summers in college before I started interning at architectural firms, I was working for them, doing everything from trim carpentry to metal buildings to running a skid steer, and, just knowing how to use a tape measure, how to lay out form boards, how to communicate with people on a job site and be safe and be efficient. It was a really good crash course in that, that I think, helps us today, even when, neither one of us is the one who's swinging the hammer the most on the job site, that we have if it needs to be done, we can do it. And we also know and appreciate everything that goes into that, and the hard work and the craft that's required in the field to bring everything to life.
Yeah, really, really well said. So I'm curious, or, just to wrap up, you moved a year ago. I can't actually believe we're recording this on a day. Like, it literally did not cross my mind. That's bizarre. I mean, I knew we were near our 1 year mark, but that's kind of crazy. But, you left this really comfortable, sought after, well-respected, well-paying job in New York City, working on some of the top projects in the country, you could say. And you took a pretty dang big risk to come down and work for what I would call a startup trying to get off the ground here in Oklahoma City, once again, right when COVID happened and all sorts of bad things. You've experienced the difficulty of running a small business and real limitations. And but what has that been like for you? And are you glad? And yeah,
super glad I did it. Like you said, it was something I really chewed on long and hard, because I loved my job and the people I was working with. And I also was living in, we're talking about walkable cities. I was in New York City, so one of America's great, walkable cities. So it was something I chewed on for a long time. But at the end of the day, I mentioned earlier, solving the problem of, bad urbanism and car-centric cities in the U.S. and also disposable housing was really appealing to team up with you and work for your company doing that, and also within a holistic design build workflow, where we can leverage all the advantages we've been discussing, and also at 28 and single, I thought this is the opportunity with what your company was doing was so unique, and then also it struck me as a great juncture to try something really hard and do something, take on a unique challenge that was important to me and I was excited about, and take a risk. And I'm thoroughly enjoying it, having a blast.
Well, I can certainly say that I am thrilled that you're here. It's been a great year, and boy, we've got so many exciting things in the works, like unbelievably exciting things in the works that I can't wait. Over the next probably year is going to start coming out that everyone will see. But really glad that you're down and enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah,
we'll talk to you guys next time.